The silence was the most expensive thing I had ever owned, and I guarded it with the fierce, quiet vigilance of a man who knew its true worth. I had purchased it with 20 years of my life, paid for in a currency of sleepless nights, hollow point fear, and the slow erosion of a name. From my penthouse apartment at the pinnacle, 1,000 feet above the ceaseless thrum of the city, the world below was reduced to a silent, sprawling circuit board of glittering lights. It was a place I could observe, but which could no longer touch me. This was the foundational principle of my retirement: to be the observer, never the observed. My name is Alex, though for the better part of my career, that name was a classified secret. I was an invisible man who moved through the world's most dangerous places, a ghost in the global machine. My work was in the shadows, ensuring the machinery of national security kept running, often in ways that could never be acknowledged. My discharge from that life was not marked by a parade, but by a single, firm handshake, and a pension that was, in essence, a lifetime of hush money. The pinnacle, with its soundproofed walls and commanding views, was meant to be my final, peaceful posting. There was, however, one glaring imperfection in my new sanctuary. On my expansive private rooftop terrace, amidst the planters of carefully chosen, unobtrusive greenery, sat the extension. It was a windowless, featureless cube, roughly the size of a small bedroom, clad in a dull, charcoal-colored composite that seemed to absorb the light around it. It stood in stark, brutalist contrast to the elegant glass and chrome of the skyscraper. A low, nearly inaudible hum emanated from it, the sound of its independent, closed-loop climate control and the powerful, ever-vigilant electronics housed within. It was an ugly, obstinate, and utterly non-negotiable condition of my presence here. It was the last piece of my old life, and my final duty was to stand watch over its quiet, orderly decommissioning. I had been a resident for less than a week when the sanctity of my silence was broken. The chimes of my doorbell were sharp, insistent, less a request for entry than a demand for an audience. I opened the door to a woman who seemed to be the living embodiment of the building's formidable price tag. Her silver hair was coiffed into a severe, elegant style that looked both expensive and punishing. A string of pearls sat on the collar of her silk blouse like a row of pale, cold teeth. Her eyes, a chilly shade of blue, performed a swift, disdainful appraisal of my apartment's minimalist decor before settling on me. "You are the new owner," she said. It was not a question, but an accusation. "I am," I replied, my voice a carefully modulated, neutral tone. "The first principle of any engagement: volunteer nothing." "I am Eleanor Covington," she announced, the name delivered as if it were a title. "I am president of the Residents Association Board. I am here about the appalling structure on your terrace." "The structure is a pre-existing fixture," I stated, using the technically accurate, if profoundly misleading, language provided to me. "Do not insult my intelligence," she snapped, her voice thin and sharp as shattered glass. "I have reviewed the building's original architectural plans. That cube is an unapproved, unsightly, and, I have no doubt, illegal modification. It is an insult to the aesthetic integrity of the pinnacle, and, by extension, to every resident who pays a small fortune to live here. I have already been in contact with our attorneys." Her motivation, I sensed, went deeper than aesthetics. As she spoke, her eyes darted around, assessing, cataloging. I recognized the look. It was the hungry, anxious gaze of someone trying to gauge the net worth and social standing of a new variable in their environment. In a place like the pinnacle, power was a delicate ecosystem, and she was its self-appointed apex predator. "The fixture is not scheduled for removal," I said, my voice remaining placid. It was a tone I had once used to inform a hostile foreign minister that his diplomatic pouch was being searched. Her lips, painted a severe shade of crimson, tightened into a bloodless line. "This is not a discussion. This is a formal notification. You have 30 days to begin the demolition process. If you fail to comply, you will discover that the board has a great many ways to make life here unpleasant." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor of the hallway with angry precision. I closed the heavy door, its sound-dampening qualities a welcome relief. I walked onto the terrace and rested my hand on the cool, smooth surface of the cube. The low hum was a familiar comfort. Eleanor Covington had just declared war, believing her most powerful weapons were bylaws and lawyers. She had no idea that her opponent was a man who had spent his life in a game where the rules were unwritten and the stakes were infinitely higher. The battle for my silence had begun. Eleanor Covington's initial assault was a campaign of meticulous, bureaucratic strangulation. She wielded the thick binder of the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions like a weapon, and the concierge, with a pained, apologetic expression, became her reluctant messenger. The official notices began to appear under my door, each a crisp, formal declaration of a new and imaginative violation. The first was the expected $500 fine for the unauthorized rooftop structure, citing bylaw 14.7 aesthetic cohesion of external spaces. It informed me that the fine would compound monthly. My response was to log into the resident portal and pay the fine immediately and silently. In my old world, this was a standard tactic. Initial compliance to a low-level provocation serves to frustrate the aggressor, who expects a confrontation. The absence of a fight is often more unnerving than the fight itself. This, of course, only fueled Eleanor's obsession. A few days later, a second notice arrived, this one for $300, citing bylaw 21.2 prohibition of excessive or persistent noise. It alleged, with a straight face, that the barely audible hum of the cube's electronics was a disruptive auditory disturbance. I knew for a fact that the hum was well below the ambient noise level of the city's ventilation systems, a detail the cube's designers had spent millions perfecting. The complaints were fabricated, ghosts she had summoned to bolster her case. I paid the fine. The absurdity escalated. I was fined for improper illumination because the small, red status light on the cube's access panel was visible from a neighboring building's rooftop, a violation of a rule clearly written to prevent garish neon signs. I was fined for a violation of the building's plumbing code, with an attached, rambling complaint that the structure's weight might be compromising the integrity of the rooftop drainage system, a claim that was a masterpiece of paranoid fiction. With each new fine, my file on her grew. I scanned every document, analyzed every phrase. This wasn't just an angry woman. This was a calculated strategy, and I began to understand the desperation behind it. A little discreet research, a skill I had not retired, painted a grim picture. Covington Capital, her husband's legendary investment firm, was quietly collapsing under the weight of a few disastrous bets. They were hemorrhaging money. The pinnacle wasn't just their home, it was their last, glittering facade, and Eleanor's position as board president was the only throne she had left. Her obsessive need to control the building's aesthetic was a desperate attempt to control the narrative of her own life, to project an image of serene, old money power while her world was crumbling around her. The ugly, defiant cube on my roof was a symbol of her powerlessness, an immovable object in the path of her frantic need for order. This knowledge didn't make me sympathetic. but it did make her predictable. A desperate player is a dangerous one, but they are also a sloppy one. My weekly calls with David, my decommissioning officer, became a strange sort of therapy. The asset is exhibiting classic signs of desperation, I told him, pacing my darkened living room. Her attacks are becoming more frequent and less rational. She's trying to build a paper trail, to create a legal justification for a more direct move. And you're just going to sit there and let her paper you to death? David asked, the sound of his skepticism clear even over the encrypted line. It's a deliberate, non-confrontational posture. I explained. Every fine I pay, every rule I comply with, weakens her position. When the time comes, I will have an impeccable record of attempted cooperation in the face of a documented campaign of harassment. It's about controlling the high ground. The high ground is a nice place to be, Alex, but don't let her box you in. You have options she can't even dream of. Using them is a last resort, I said, more to myself than to him. The day I have to use those options is the day I admit I've failed at being a civilian. I felt the truth of that statement deeply. My retirement was a promise I had made to myself, a chance to live a life where my past was not a weapon to be wielded. I was trying to solve this problem as the man I wanted to be, not the man I had been. But as another notice slid under my door, this one a truly inventive find for the Cube's negative impact on the building's satellite television reception, I felt a growing sense of futility. I was trying to play chess with a person who was determined to knock over the board. My non-confrontational posture was not de-escalating the situation. It was only convincing her that she could push harder, that there would be no consequences. And that was a dangerous belief for a desperate woman to hold. The paper siege had failed to dislodge me. My silent, immediate payment of every fine seemed to act as an accelerant on Eleanor's frustration. My compliance was a form of defiance she couldn't comprehend. If she couldn't find me into submission, she decided she would try to provoke me. The conflict escalated from the sterile formality of official notices to the petty, physical realm of minor vandalism, each act a carefully deniable message of her escalating rage. The first physical violation was an act of calculated insolence. The access door to the cube, a seamless panel of reinforced composite, was controlled by a biometric hand scanner. I came out to the terrace one morning to find the scanner's glass plate smeared with a thick, greasy, opaque substance. It looked like some kind of industrial lubricant, and it rendered the scanner useless until it was cleaned. It was a minor inconvenience, but a significant escalation. She had physically touched a critical component of the system. She had crossed a line from legal harassment to illegal tampering. I felt a familiar, cold surge of adrenaline, the kind that precedes a critical decision in the field. My training screamed at me to escalate my own security, to deploy the countermeasures I had at my disposal. But I resisted. Doing so would reveal my capabilities. A violation of the primary rule of engagement: never show your enemy your true strength until the final, decisive moment. Instead, I documented the act with a series of high-resolution, time-stamped photographs and added them to the Covington Doctrine file. Then, I cleaned it. The substance was stubborn, but I had resources. From a small, locked case in my study, a case that contained relics of my former life, I retrieved a small aerosol can labeled Decontaminant Agent 7. It was a classified solvent, designed to remove chemical residues from sensitive electronic equipment without leaving a trace. I sprayed a small amount onto a sterile cloth and gently wiped the scanner. The grease dissolved instantly, leaving the glass pristine. To any observer, it would have looked like I was using a simple can of window cleaner. A week later, she struck again. Running from the side of the cube was a single, heavily shielded coaxial cable that connected to a satellite uplink. I found it one afternoon, cleanly severed. My heart hammered in my chest for a moment before my training took over. I did a quick diagnostic. The severed line was a decoy, a non-critical data cable I had insisted the installation team include for precisely this kind of scenario. The real, fiber optic line was hidden within the building's core infrastructure. Her sabotage was an illusion. She thought she had cut my communications. In reality, she had only revealed her own desperation. I documented the cut cable, then performed a flawless, professional splice. A skill I had learned in a dusty, sun-baked corner of the world, where reliable communications were the difference between life and death. The repair was so clean, it was virtually invisible. I had again denied her the satisfaction of a lasting mark. My restraint, however, was taking a toll on my own peace of mind. I found myself in a state of constant, low-grade hypervigilance, my senses always on alert. I was scanning for threats, analyzing behaviors, sleeping with one ear open. The quiet I had sought was being replaced by the silent tension of a Cold War. This internal conflict came to a head during a phone call with David. She cut a decoy data line. I reported, my voice a flat monotone. A decoy, David sounded surprised. That was smart. Alex, you planned for this. I planned for a contingency. David, I didn't plan for my retirement to feel like a low-intensity conflict zone. I snapped, a rare note of anger in my voice. I'm spending my days documenting petty acts of vandalism and trying to resist the urge to deploy countermeasures that would put this woman and her entire board of directors in a federal prison. I'm trying to solve this like a civilian, and it's not working. What would the old Alex do? He asked quietly. I sighed, the anger draining away, replaced by a weary resignation. The old Alex would have already had her under 24/7 surveillance. He would have found her financial weak spots, her personal secrets, and used them to neutralize her as a threat before she even knew she was in a fight. He would have ended this, quietly and ruthlessly. And the new Alex. The new Alex is tired of that game, I said, looking out at the city below. He's trying to find a way to win without becoming the person he was paid to be for 20 years. There was a long pause. Just remember, David said finally, his voice soft. Sometimes the only way to protect the peace is to be willing to fight for it. Don't let your new principles put you in a position where you can't defend yourself. The package is still the priority. I hung up, the weight of his words settling on me. My desire to live by a new, more peaceful code was admirable, but it was also a potential vulnerability. Eleanor Covington was not constrained by any such moral code. She was a woman spiraling, and her next move, I knew, would be to try and turn my own home into a prison of whispers. Having failed to provoke a direct response through minor physical attacks, Eleanor shifted her strategy to a more insidious form of warfare, one that required no physical proximity but could be just as damaging. She began a systematic campaign of social isolation and slander, using the building's internal communication systems to paint me as a shadowy, dangerous figure, and the cube on my roof as a threat to the entire community. Her goal was to make my presence in the building so toxic that the other residents would join her crusade, giving her the consensus she needed for a more drastic, board-sanctioned action. The primary weapon in her arsenal was the building's daily email newsletter, the Pinnacle Post, which she personally curated. Her attacks were never direct, but were couched in the language of neighborly concern, a friendly security reminder. One email began, It's come to our attention that the penthouse level has been experiencing unusual levels of electromagnetic interference. While we're sure it's nothing to worry about, you may notice some minor disruptions to your television and internet service. The board is investigating the source of this anomaly. It was a complete fabrication, of course. The cube was a closed system, shielded to military-grade specifications. It emitted less EM interference than a microwave oven. But the lie was clever. It was technical enough to sound plausible, and vague enough to be unnerving. It transformed my home from a private residence into a source of public inconvenience and mystery. Her next email blast was even more pointed. The board has received several inquiries about our resident vetting process. She wrote, "Please be assured that the Pinnacle has always prided itself on attracting residents of the highest character and repute. However, in an era of shell corporations and opaque trusts, it is sometimes difficult to know who one's neighbors truly are. We urge all residents to remain vigilant." She was skillfully crafting a narrative. I was not just an unknown. I was a potentially dangerous unknown. The seeds of suspicion she planted began to take root in the fertile ground of the residents' paranoia. The atmosphere in the building grew colder. The polite, distant nods I'd received in the elevator were replaced by averted eyes and a stony silence. I became the man in the penthouse, a figure of rumor and speculation. I decided to attend one of the building's monthly resident mixers in the Grand Library, not to socialize, but to gather intelligence. As I stood in a corner, nursing a club soda, I became a gravitational center of avoidance. People would give my corner a wide berth, their conversations dropping to a whisper as they passed. But I was trained to listen, to observe, and I could piece together the narrative from the fragments I overheard. No one even knows his real name. Some kind of recluse. Heard he's a tech billionaire. A real eccentric. That thing on the roof is a private server farm. My broker told me he bought the unit through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Sounds like dirty money to me. Eleanor is right to be concerned. It's affecting the building's prestige. I saw Eleanor holding court by the fireplace. A picture of regal concern, fanning the flames of gossip with carefully chosen words. I watched her talk to a younger couple. Her voice a low, confidential murmur. Structural integrity. The board's engineers are very worried. Of course, we're doing everything we can. My internal struggle intensified. The old Alex, the field agent, would have thrived in this environment. He would have identified the key players, cultivated a confidential informant, and launched a counter-campaign of disinformation, seeding his own rumors about Eleanor's precarious finances and her husband's failing business. It would have been easy. Too easy. But the new Alex, the man who had come here for peace, felt a profound sense of weariness. This was the exact kind of poison I had left behind: the whispers, the lies, the manipulation. To engage in it would be to admit defeat, to concede that I couldn't escape the man I used to be. I was caught in a paradox. To preserve my peaceful, civilian life, I was being forced to think like a spy. The call with David that night was tense. "She's successfully poisoned the well," I reported. "I'm socially isolated. She's created a united front. She now has the political capital within the building to take her next step without fear of internal opposition." "And what do you think that next step is?" David asked. "She's going to try to bring in an outside authority again," I said. "But she'll be smarter this time. She won't come at me with a low-level inspector. She'll use the social consensus she's built as leverage. She'll go to the city with a petition signed by other residents. She'll manufacture a crisis and then invite the authorities in to solve it." My quiet retirement had become a strategic exercise. Every day was a new calculation. a new assessment of a constantly evolving threat. I was winning every battle, but the war was taking its toll on my soul. I had come to this place to be anonymous. But Eleanor Covington had made me a legend, a ghost story told in the hushed tones of the wealthy and the paranoid. And her next move would be to try and exorcise me for good. The social isolation campaign had been brutally effective. Eleanor had successfully painted me as a menace, and, with the silent consent of my nervous neighbors, she prepared for her next, most audacious escalation. She intended to leverage the manufactured panic within the building to bring in an outside authority with the power to force a confrontation. She was no longer just probing my defenses. She was trying to orchestrate a full-scale siege. The opening salvo of this new phase came in the form of the city's fire department. It was a brilliant, cynical move. Nothing creates a sense of immediate crisis in a high-rise building like the specter of a fire hazard. One afternoon, the piercing shriek of the fire alarm echoed through the building, followed by a series of automated, disembodied announcements urging residents to remain calm. A few minutes later, my intercom buzzed. It was the frantic voice of the building manager. "Mr. Alex, the fire department is here. They've received a report of a possible electrical fire on the penthouse level, originating from an unpermitted rooftop structure." I could see Eleanor's hand in the specificity of the complaint. This wasn't a random alarm. This was a targeted strike. "There is no fire." "Robert," I said calmly, "it's a false alarm. But send the fire marshal up." I met Fire Marshal Davies and two of his firefighters at my door. He was a large, no-nonsense man, whose face was etched with the weary impatience of someone who had seen too many false alarms. "We got a call about smoke and a smell of burning wires from your roof." "Sir," he said, his eyes scanning my apartment. "Marshal, I can assure you, my smoke detectors are functioning perfectly, and there has been no fire." I said, "You're welcome to inspect my apartment. However, the structure on the terrace is a secure facility. There is no fire there." "With all due respect, sir, I can't take your word for it," Davies said, his jaw set. "A report of an electrical fire in a skyscraper is the most serious call we get. I have to visually inspect the source of the complaint." This was the confrontation she had engineered. He was a fire marshal, a man with a legal and moral mandate that was difficult to refuse. But letting him inside the cube was an absolute impossibility. I looked at him, my mind racing through protocols and contingency plans. "Marshal," I said, my voice low and serious, "I understand your position completely, and I respect it. But I am telling you that the facility on my roof is federally protected. It is exempt from local inspection." Davies let out an exasperated sigh. "Sir, I've heard it all. Everyone's got a reason. But a fire doesn't care about your exemptions." I knew I had only one option left, a card I had hoped never to play. It was a step beyond the redacted document I had shown the building inspectors. It was a move that would irrevocably compromise my cover, but was necessary to protect the asset. "Marshal Davies," I said formally, "as of this moment, I am officially invoking the National Security Act of 1947, Section 102A. I am informing you that your attempt to enter this facility constitutes an unacceptable risk to a matter of ongoing national security. You do not have the operational clearance to proceed." The fire marshal stared at me, his expression shifting from impatience to utter disbelief. The technical jargon, the specific legal citation, it was so far outside the realm of his daily experience that it stopped him cold. "What in the hell are you talking about?" he finally asked. I'm talking about the fact that if you attempt to force entry into that facility, this false alarm will become a federal incident," I said, my voice remaining level and calm. "I am giving you my word, as a representative of the United States government, that there is no fire. The complaint was filed maliciously. I suggest you trace the call. In the meantime, you can verify my authority through the Department of Justice's National Security Division. You will find they are expecting your call." The firefighters behind him exchanged nervous glances. I had just escalated the situation from a municipal issue to a federal one. I had dropped the name of the DOJ's most powerful and secretive division. I was either a very convincing lunatic or someone he absolutely did not want to cross. He chose to err on the side of caution. He held up his radio. "Dispatch, this is Marshal Davies at the Pinnacle. Stand down, all units. We have a jurisdictional issue here. Code 4. I'll explain in my report." He looked at me one last time. His eyes filled with a new, wary respect. "You're going to cause a hell of a lot of paperwork," he grumbled before turning and leaving. The moment they were gone, my carefully constructed calm crumbled. I sagged against the doorframe, the adrenaline leaving me shaky. This was a massive escalation. I had been forced to openly declare the cube's federal status to a city official. The veil of secrecy was shredded. My call to David was grim. I had to invoke 102A. The fire department responded to a bogus call. There was no other way to deny them entry without a physical confrontation. David was silent for a long moment. "The director has been notified," he said finally. "The DOJ is already running interference with the city, classifying the incident report. But Alex, your cover is blown. The asset, this woman, she now knows you're not just some stubborn civilian. She knows you have some kind of government protection. That's not going to make her back down. It's going to make her dig deeper. She's going to see this as a conspiracy, and she's going to make one last, desperate push." He was right. I had repelled her attack, but I had also revealed a piece of my hand. I had shown her I was more than she thought. And, for a woman like Eleanor Covington, a woman obsessed with status and power, discovering that the target of her harassment was connected to a power far greater than her own would not be a deterrent. It would be an intolerable insult, one that would drive her to her final, most reckless act of war. The failed fire department raid was the point of no return. I had been forced to invoke national security, a move that had successfully repelled the authorities, but had also confirmed to Eleanor that I was not what I seemed. For a woman like her, whose entire identity was built on a fragile scaffold of perceived status and control, this revelation was not a warning to back off. It was an unbearable provocation. The knowledge that her reclusive, rule-breaking neighbor was protected by a power she couldn't understand or overcome was a narcissistic injury of the highest order. Her campaign against me morphed from a mission of control into a righteous, obsessive crusade. Her final gambit was a legal masterstroke of breathtaking audacity. Having been thwarted by federal authority in the real world, she decided to challenge that authority in the one arena she understood: the courtroom. Her high-priced legal team, armed with the petition signed by the nervous residents and a mountain of her fabricated complaints, filed for an emergency injunction in the county court. The lawsuit they crafted was a work of paranoid genius. It no longer just cited HOA bylaws. It wove a grand conspiracy theory, portraying me as a shadowy figure using a fraudulent claim of national security to conceal a dangerous and illegal operation. It alleged that the structure was a rogue server farm, a hub for cryptocurrency mining, or perhaps even a base for foreign espionage, anything and everything that would play on a local judge's fears of the unknown. The lawsuit's core demand was simple and devastating. It asked the court to grant the HOA the authority to hire a private demolition crew to forcibly dismantle the structure, and to grant them a writ of assistance, compelling the local police to protect the crew as they worked. This was her checkmate. She was using a local court order to directly challenge a federal security protocol, creating a jurisdictional crisis she hoped to win through sheer force of will. She had me served with the court summons publicly, in the building's lobby, an act of pure theatrical humiliation. I stood in my apartment, the thick legal document in my hand. Sarah, my fictional wife in the carefully constructed cover story I had given the building management, was away visiting her equally fictional sick mother. I was alone, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a tremor of real, cold fear. Not for myself, but for the consequences of what Eleanor had set in motion. A court-ordered demolition crew, protected by the police, attempting to take a plasma cutter to a classified intelligence facility, was a scenario that could end in tragedy. The Cube had defensive countermeasures, systems designed to protect its secrets at any cost. A forced breach would trigger a protocol that would not distinguish between a hostile foreign agent and a local demolition worker. My internal struggle was over. My attempt to live as a civilian, to solve this problem with patience and restraint, had failed. I had been backed into a corner where my own principles of non-engagement were now a direct threat to public safety. I sat in my office and stared at a photograph on my desk. It was the only personal item I allowed myself. It was a faded picture of myself and a man named Richard Hayes, taken years ago in a dusty, war-torn city. Richard had been my station chief, my mentor, and my friend. He had died in that city, a victim of a security breach that had started with something small, something that had been dismissed as a minor anomaly. I had sworn after his death that I would never again allow a situation to escalate through inaction. I picked up the secure satellite phone and made the call. "David," I said, my voice as calm and steady as I could make it. "It's time. She has a local court order for demolition. She's bringing in a civilian crew, with a police escort. The situation is no longer tenable. The risk of a catastrophic incident is too high." The line was silent for a few seconds. I could hear the faint, distant sound of keyboards clicking, the low hum of the agency's nerve center. "The order has been given, Alex," David said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, replaced by the cold, clipped tone of an operations officer. "The director has signed off. The Department of Justice is being looped in. We are moving to neutralize the threat. What is your status?" "I am secure," I said. "I will remain on site to observe and report." "Understood," he said. "And Alex, try to stay out of the fire." I hung up the phone. I knew what was coming. It wasn't the kind of solution I had wanted, but it was the one she had earned. I had tried to be a quiet neighbor. I had tried to be a man of peace. But Eleanor Covington, in her blind, arrogant fury, had reminded me of a fundamental truth from my old life. Some conflicts cannot be resolved. They can only be won. And the victory is often devastating. The rooftop of the Pinnacle felt like the stage for the final act of a tragedy. The sky was a brilliant, indifferent blue. Eleanor stood near the center of the terrace, a conquering queen in her own kingdom. She was flanked by her lawyers, their faces smug and triumphant. A captain from the city police department stood with them, holding the local court order as if it were a sacred text. The demolition crew, 6 burly men in hard hats, were making their final preparations, their plasma cutters and hydraulic pry bars laid out like surgical instruments. A small, curated audience of Eleanor's most ardent supporters watched from a safe distance, their faces a mixture of fear and vindicated excitement. I stood alone, near the edge of the terrace, a silent observer. My instructions were to do nothing, to let the protocol unfold. Eleanor approached me, her eyes glittering with the cold fire of absolute victory. "Well, it seems we've reached the end of the line. Mr. Doe," she said, the name a final, dismissive insult. "I gave you every opportunity to be reasonable. Now, you get to watch as your hideous little secret is torn apart, piece by piece." She gave a sharp, imperious nod to the foreman of the demolition crew. "You may begin." The foreman raised his plasma cutter. The tool hissed to life, a bright, angry spark at its tip. He took a step toward the seamless wall of the cube. This was the moment of intervention, but it did not come with the thunder of a helicopter or the crash of a tactical team. It came with the quiet, almost polite arrival of two individuals from the stairwell access door. They were a man and a woman, both dressed in the sober, conservative suits of government lawyers. They moved with a calm, unhurried purpose that was more intimidating than any show of force. They were followed by a uniformed United States Marshal. They walked directly to the police captain, ignoring everyone else. The woman, who appeared to be in the lead, presented a thin leather folder. "Captain, I am Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Riley, from the Department of Justice, National Security Division. This is a matter of federal jurisdiction." The captain, a man used to being the ultimate authority at any scene, was visibly taken aback. He looked at her credentials, his face paling slightly. "Ms. Riley then turned her calm, intelligent gaze on Eleanor. "Are you Eleanor Covington?" "I am," Eleanor said, her voice sharp with indignation. "And you are interrupting a court-ordered procedure." "Actually, ma'am, we are here to stop you from committing a serious federal crime." "Ms." Riley said, her voice remaining placid, but carrying an edge of steel. She handed a thick document to Eleanor's lead lawyer. "This is an emergency injunction issued by a federal judge just this morning. It supersedes and permanently quashes your county court order. It places this entire rooftop, and specifically the structure you are about to demolish, under federal protection." Eleanor's lawyer began frantically flipping through the document, his smug expression collapsing into one of slack-jawed horror. "The U.S. Marshall then stepped forward and addressed Eleanor directly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a deep, formal baritone. "I am here to serve you with this." He handed her a different document. "This is a temporary restraining order, issued by the United States District Court. It legally prohibits you, and any member of the HOA board, from approaching within 500 feet of this facility. It also serves as a formal notice that you and the board are the subjects of a federal investigation regarding your attempts to interfere with a national security asset." The word investigation hung in the air, a chilling counterpoint to the sunny afternoon. The residents who had come to watch a demolition now found themselves witnesses to a federal takedown. Eleanor stared at the papers in her hand, her face a mask of disbelief. "This is absurd," she finally sputtered. That box is not a matter of national security. I am the president of this association. I have a right to protect our property values." "Ms. Riley from the DOJ took a step closer. Her voice dropped, becoming low and confidential, but her words were devastatingly clear. "Mrs. Covington, let me be very frank. For the past several months, you have engaged in a campaign of harassment against a private citizen who is, in fact, a protected government asset. You have now used the courts to attempt to forcibly compromise a secure facility that houses technology vital to the interests of the United States. The only reason you are not in handcuffs right now is because the government prefers to handle matters of this sensitivity with discretion. You will be contacted by our office for a series of interviews. You will cooperate fully. You will never speak of what you have learned here today to anyone. If you violate that order, the full weight of the United States government will be brought to bear upon you in a manner that will make your current financial difficulties. She paused, letting the pointed remark land with surgical precision, seem like a minor inconvenience. Do you understand me? The mention of her financial troubles was the final, crushing blow. It told her that they didn't just know about the cube. They knew everything about her. Her secrets, her vulnerabilities, all of it laid bare. She looked from the cold, determined face of the government lawyer to the silent, imposing marshal, to me. In my quiet, impassive expression, she finally saw not a stubborn neighbor, but the architect of her complete and utter ruin. The color drained from her face as she finally understood. She hadn't been fighting a man. She had been fighting a ghost, and the ghost had won. The justice that followed was not the explosive, cinematic ruin that a lesser story might demand, but a quiet, bureaucratic grinding that was, in its own way, far more satisfying and absolute. The federal government had no interest in a public trial that would draw attention to its compromised safe house. Instead of espionage charges, Eleanor Covington was crushed by the silent, immense pressure of the system she had tried to manipulate. She was subjected to a series of grueling, closed-door interviews with stone-faced lawyers from the Department of Justice. At the end of it, she was forced to sign a permanent, binding non-disclosure agreement, a gag order that legally prohibited her from ever speaking about the cube, me, or the events on the rooftop, under threat of immediate federal prosecution. The government also levied a crippling civil fine against her personally for the costs incurred by their intervention, a sum that accelerated the collapse of her already fragile finances. The real justice, however, came from the community she had terrorized. Word of the federal investigation, though not its specific details, leaked among the residents. The revelation that Eleanor had used HOA funds to launch her personal, legally disastrous crusade was the final betrayal. The board turned on her, stripping her of her presidency. A class action lawsuit was filed by a coalition of residents to recoup the misspent funds and the fines she had improperly levied. This, combined with the federal penalties, was the final blow. The Covingtons were forced into bankruptcy. They sold their penthouse at a loss and vanished from the world of the Pinnacle, their social and financial ruin complete. Her destruction was not the result of a single, dramatic explosion, but of 1,000 cuts, most of them self-inflicted. In the wake of the scandal, the HOA was completely restructured, its oppressive rulebook replaced with a simple charter of mutual respect. The building, once a hotbed of paranoia, relaxed into a community of quiet, private people who now valued their anonymity above all else. My life found the equilibrium I had sought. The compromised cube was quietly and professionally decommissioned, its contents removed in the dead of night, leaving behind an empty, silent monument to the conflict. The agency, as a gesture of apology for the disruption, arranged for the title of the penthouse to be transferred to me personally, free and clear of any trust or shell corporation, giving me, for the first time in my adult life, a true and simple home. My peace is no longer a fragile thing to be guarded, but a solid, settled reality. I am still the quiet man in the penthouse, but the whispers are gone, replaced by a respectful, unspoken understanding. I had to briefly become the man I used to be in order to become the man I wanted to be. And in the profound, unbroken silence, 1,000 feet above the world, I am finally and truly retired.